MCEC's 19th Annual National Training Seminar. We have some great sessions for you this morning, and we'll end our program about 12:15. Following our symposia on social, emotional, and personalized learning. At this time, I would like to introduce Colonel Retired Dave LePan. He will moderate our first symposia on issues and challenges of putting policy into practice, the Every Student Succeeds Act. Some of you may have seen Dave on the news recently. Welcome. We're supposed to.
All right. All right, since we're in DC, and I'm in DC, but I came from the MCEC world, I have to start by saying, hey, y'all, even though I don't normally talk like that. So the panel this morning, a couple of notes for you. Unfortunately, although fortunately for one of them, because it's due to the birth of a grandchild, so Dr. Staples couldn't join us today because of the birth of a grandchild. And Robert Pondicio also had a conflict and wasn't able to join us. So we have three great distinguished panelists that we'll get to in just a moment. The two pieces of focus for you with this panel. One, as Ann said at the beginning, it's this idea of turning policy into practice. So we're going to talk about a big piece of federal legislation, the Every Student Succeeds Act, also known as Essa. But what we want to talk about is what does Essa, which again is a large piece of federal legislation, mean to all of you? What happens down at the state and local level where you're most concerned about your children, your schools, your educators? So that's what we want to get to in the panel. Part of the reason that I'm back here again is that I had the honor of moderating a panel last year. So the Every Student Succeeds Act was passed and signed into law by President Obama at the end of 2015. So at last year's NTS, Essa was then only about 6 or 7 months old. So we had the idea that 1 year hence, here for this NTS, it might be nice to revisit where are we today. 1 year later, 18 months or so past the passage of Essa, a new administration, a new Secretary of Education, and also 1 year plus of the Department of Education's ability to implement this law. So that's sort of the focus of where we'll go today. You have biographical information on all your panelists, so I won't take time introducing them, but I will point out that what we have to talk about policy to practice is a gentleman, Mike Cohen from Achieve, who does this all the time. He can talk to the federal piece of this, he can talk to the state and local piece. He sees this from both sides. Dr. Monique Chisholm is at the Department of Education. Dr. Chisholm was at the Department of Education last year at this time. She wasn't with us on the panel at the time, but she certainly will bring the perspective of what Essa looks like from the Department of Education perspective. And then Major General Haston comes from two perspectives that are important to us. One, as a parent and as a military leader, but two, somebody who sees this at the state level. So Mike can address, again, state or federal down to state to local. Dr. Chisholm can talk about the policy and how that's being implemented. And General Haston can talk about, again, what it means down at the state level as a military leader and as a parent. And one last thing to remind you about that we will talk about on the panel is while Essa is a large piece, I've said that a few times, so foot stomper, large piece of federal legislation, has a lot of stuff in it. It covers a lot of areas. Everything that it does has some impact on you and your children. But from a military's perspective, one piece of the legislation is the creation of a military student identifier. And we'll definitely talk about that. You may know that before the passage of Essa, 19 different states had passed some form of a military student identifier. Those states are in various states, not to use the same word twice, but in a different context, of implementation of the student identifier. But Essa now requires it across all 50 states. And one point to add that I will definitely ask Major General Haston to address is the fact that the legislation as passed does not mandate inclusion of the children of National Guard and Reserve. Of the 19 states I mentioned, some of those do include National Guard and Reserve students. And I would point out that in the conference report that accompanied the legislation, there was an effort to advocate that the military student identifier include the National Guard and Reserve students, but it's not a requirement, it's not a mandate. So again, the conference committee thought that that was important, but it didn't make it into the legislation. MCEC and the National Guard Association, others have been large proponents of trying to address that and make sure National Guard and Reserve children are included as well. So I will stop talking. Since Michael Cohen was here with us a year ago, I'd like to start with him and have him sort of revisit where we are now 1 year later, especially based on what he had to say last year when it was only 6 months old.
Well, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I think this is the third or fourth time I've participated in a panel with this session, and this is one of the conferences I look forward to attending and participating in every year, mainly because you all do such great and important work, and also because Mary keeps reminding me I should come. She keeps asking, and I keep saying yes. So I'm really thrilled to be here. Last year at this time, right, one other bit of background. Earlier in my career, I was Assistant Secretary of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education, overseeing the implementation of the 1994 version of this law. So one lesson I've learned from that is a reminder of, number one, just how long it takes to implement federal legislation, right? This does not bring about immediate changes. It doesn't bring about changes very quickly. And because the governance of education is so complicated, the federal government's got a role, the state government has a very big role, your local school board surely has a big role. By the time you see things changing in your child's school or classroom, to be honest, you'd be hard-pressed to figure out whether that's because the federal government changed the law, because the state government changed the policy, because the local school board did something, or because your school's principal and teacher made a decision, right? It is just hard to trace all of that stuff. So don't get unduly concerned about what's in the law, what's not in the law, except, of course, the military student identifier, which I'll come back to in a second. But a lot of the provisions you may or may not see any real effect on. What you should be paying the most attention to if you're a parent is what your kid's teacher and principal and local school board are doing. That's where most of the decisions are going to get made that will affect your child. So that's one big thing to keep in mind, I think. Secondly, though, there has been progress, right? First of all, Essa does provide states and districts in particular with more flexibility than it used to. There is still a requirement for testing every student 3 to 8 in high school in reading and math. That's to make sure that there's attention paid to those subjects and the students who are struggling in it. But there's more room for other kinds of accountability indicators to enter into the equation when it's time to evaluate schools. And states have quite a bit of flexibility on this. So they could add other subjects. Science is one. And some states test science every grade. Others test science once every 4 or 5 years or so. So that's you'll see big differences, particularly as you look at different states. They could include indicators of school discipline, of teacher and student and parental attitudes as measured through surveys, as indicators of students' social and emotional well-being. So there's more room for more things to enter into the evaluation of a school, and that will play out over a number of years. That's worth paying attention to. last point I want to make, I think, to start this conversation is, again, come back to the importance of the military student identifier. And that's important for a number of reasons. First of all, because it will force more states, more school districts, and more schools to actually pay attention to the performance, progress, and needs, right, of military-connected students, the challenges they face, and the strengths that they bring. Secondly, you should expect to see over time, right, because of the data that will be collected, more research and a better understanding of the trajectories that military students are on, what tends to disrupt those trajectories, either in a positive or a negative way, and what interventions can allow for better support for students. So I think that's a particularly important thing, obviously, to pay attention to and to watch.
All right, thank you. So Dr. Chisholm, tell us where the Department of Education is today with the implementation of Essa.
Great. First off, just let me start by saying hello and thank you for the invitation to be here. I want to start by saying thank you to all the men and women and families for your service to the United States, to America. The sacrifices that you make every single day are not lost, and so thank you very much for all the hard work and your dedication and the sacrifices that you've made for our country. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you to you. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about the implementation of Essa. There's a lot of really exciting things that are going on at the department. I know that you don't think about the federal government as an exciting place, but there's a lot going on right now. I agree with Mike that it takes a while for one to see the impact of federal policy at the local level in the classroom, where the rubber hits the road, the teacher, student. But I think that there are some really significant things that have happened in the last year and a half that will manifest itself in this coming school year. And so Mike touched on one of the most important things. The first thing, the law requires, for the first time codified in law, that all students are taught to college and career ready standards. So you've probably started to see this in many of your states already, this transition to standards that are college and career ready. There were only a couple of states that had not made that transition fully. But this is something that you will start to see in the classrooms. It will impact the way the teachers are teaching. It will impact professional development. It will impact resources. And so that's one of the first major shifts. I think the other thing that to just highlight about the importance is that at the heart of the first Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, it was, I would argue, a civil rights law. And it was set out to make sure that there were guardrails and protections in place to ensure that every student had access to a high-quality education. You continue to see that in the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the importance of the disaggregation of information through the military student identifier is one way that a guardrail is put in place for to look at performance, supports, and interventions for students. But that's built into the accountability system also. States are required to identify low-performing schools. They're required to identify high schools that have a 67% or less graduation rate. They are required to identify schools where a student group is consistently underperforming. And so one of the things that you will see next year is that states will have their identification systems in place, where they will start to identify schools and districts based upon the metrics and the indicators that they have put into their system. I think the other thing that you will start to see fairly quickly is the way in which supports and interventions are occurring within the school and the district. One of the major provisions of the new law is that there is a requirement for evidence-based strategies. And in the education space, that's often hard to do, to focus on randomized field-controlled studies in order to prove that an outcome is going to work. So the law has built in an opportunity for scaffolding evidence-based, and so I think that's one of the impacts that you're going to see this year and next year. But where we are at the department, we have issued a number of guidance documents. The guidance is non-regulatory, and so really what we have tried to do through the guidance is to identify some promising practices, some effective practices, to help make the plain language of the law understandable for teachers, parents, administrators, students. And so we have a number of guidance documents that we have put out and have been working with our technical assistance centers to help to provide information. We also have a regulation that is effective now that is directly connected to the assessments That regulation was passed several months ago and went into effect, and so that's moving forward. We had been doing a lot of work on a regulation related to school report cards, accountability systems, and also the statewide plan. And that regulation was rescinded during the first part of the transition of the administration. So we've been providing a lot of technical assistance to try to help states, districts, schools understand the requirements of the law absent the regulation. And then finally, what's been keeping us probably the busiest the last couple of months is the submission of state plans. So under the law, states are required to submit a plan to the Secretary for review and approval. And this plan does a couple of things. One, it allows the Secretary to disperse money across several title programs, but it also helps the state to articulate their vision for education, education reform, as it relates to the requirements of the law. So we have approached the state plan as an opportunity for states to engage stakeholders, to have the difficult conversations about education, and use this as an ongoing way to improve education in the state rather than a compliance exercise. So the first 17 plans came in April. We had 16 states and the District of Columbia submit their plans. We went through a peer review process where we brought in subject matter experts across the nation to look at the state plans and to assess whether they had met the requirements of the law based upon the context of the state. And then our team at the Department of Education has been reviewing the peer review feedback, having internal deliberations, and we provided feedback to those states about where we felt that there was some ambiguity about what they had articulated in their plan and what was required in the law. And we're right now in the process of finalizing the recommendations to the Secretary for those first 17 plans. I'm happy to say that we made our first approval of a state plan yesterday. Delaware was the first state to be approved, and we will be continuing to move forward with that process. And so, in a nutshell, that's what's going on at the Department of Education right now.
Great, thank you. So, General, tell us what it looks like down at the state level and talk a little about, again, the importance to the National Guard family and the reserve component of the Military Student Identifier.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is thanks for asking me to be part of this with my wife. Introducing you. She has educated me. I'm a military child. My dad did 44 years in the Tennessee National Guard, and I'm a military grandchild. So I will tell you that both of them would have told you that if the Army wanted you to have a family, they would have issued you one in the supply room. But through my operational experience over the years, I have found out that our military families and our military children are combat multipliers. And so everything that we can do for our Guard families or our military families, we need to do because it makes us a more ready force. In Tennessee, and that's what I can speak of because that is my area of operation, we have near 14,000 Air and Army National Guardsmen there. We have military families and military kids in every zip code in Tennessee. And when people look at focusing on military kids in clusters, we normally look at large Guard bases or military bases like at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And Montgomery County is just one area. We have young people across the state of Tennessee. I guess I want to go back and kind of quote what Dr. Biden said the other night when she spoke, is that military families and military kids are not victims. And that is, I mean, that is absolutely, I can't say that loud enough. Our military kids are the most resilient, best leaders. They can accomplish things that their contemporaries can't do simply because they've experienced it. We talk about Guard kids and being just in the state. My Guard families move constantly. I have full-time employees. I have over 2,500 full-time employees in the state, and they're in constant motion. I have Guard members that lives in Bulgaria. That's our state partner. and he has his family there. We have military families that work here in D.C. at the National Guard Bureau and all over the country. So Guard, it's a little bit of a misnomer sometimes that Guard and Reserve just are in the local state. So understanding that across all of our school systems, and I've worked with our Commissioner of Education, because I'm a commissioner in Tennessee, and we have 23 directorates, and I've worked with our commissioner in getting the military identifier out to all of our school districts. I think we have 119 different school districts across Tennessee, and getting that out to the leadership down at the user level has been accomplished, but it has not been done for every child. We think that it's important because when you have, in Tennessee, we've deployed over 20,000 people since 9/11. Some of them multiple times, some of them multiple parents gone at the same time. And so when you have that child and that educator doesn't understand what's going on in that child's life, I think that is extremely critical because it's indicators. It gives that understanding of what that child may be experiencing. The other thing is that it identifies that child for that teacher because that teacher can extract the leadership qualities in that child. And I personally, I think that's extremely important. And then I'll tie that back into the readiness issue. What we do in the military, and I don't say this lightly, is that we're to defend this nation, and that in a combat operation. And all the equipment, all the things that we have is designed to do that. And it's non-discriminatory about who it does it to. So when I have a soldier or an airman that's out training, I want their minds and heads in the game. I want them focusing on their job. If they're thinking about that family member or that child that has an issue or a problem, their mind's not in that game. And so it comes full circle as being a readiness issue, for me and my forces. So having said that, it took me a while to learn that. As an operational commander, as a squadron commander, as a regimental commander, I was focusing on that readiness. I was focusing on, and I wasn't focusing on, the family and the children that we have serving and the soldiers that work for me. And I found out, I guess, the hard way of my son and being deployed and being gone and just, seeing the things, that he missed. And I said, we can fix this. So inside Tennessee in our operational, I took all these different programs and stuff that we had, the family support programs, everything that we had, and we put it under a separate directorate. And it's our family programs, but it's called our J9. I have my director here with me today. But we call it the Circle of Life. My son, and as most of y'all know, the Lion King, you remember that movie? And I believe I could quote it. But he watched it, and so we call it the Circle of Life because we have it from military kids to military funerals. And we have found that putting the effort and the energy in that and getting that synergy and that synchronization of all those programs together has helped our military families. And the military kids is a huge part of that. Trying to link that to their school systems and making sure that their educators know that is a military child is extremely important to us. And Rome wasn't built in a day, but we keep chipping at that, and we feel like in Tennessee that at some point in time we will have that established.
Okay, thank you. And Hakuna Matata. So I'd like to go back to Dr. Chisholm, but let me preface it before I ask you the question, because both General Haston and Mr. Cohen brought up an important point about how much is actually local, of what people see, and this idea that with something like the military student identifier, getting momentum at the local level and in the state is almost as important, and some could say more important, than what's happening at the federal level. As I mentioned, the law doesn't mandate inclusion of National Guard and Reserve children. doesn't stop the states from acting on that on their own, so there might be a way to address it from that point. But Dr. Chisholm, can you talk about what the Department of Education is doing specifically with the Military Student Identifier and how it's implementing that aspect of it?
Great. It's a really important inclusion in the law. So one of the things that I think is very important in any education system is transparency. And you can only get at transparency if you are providing data and information to all stakeholders to make sure that they have the information they need to help to support the education system. And so it's a really important provision. So one of the things that is going to be required this school year is the state and district report cards. And so this will be the first time that you see the military identifier included in the state and district report cards. Part of our process of supporting implementation is to do a number of things. One, the non-regulatory guidance, and this is certainly where we look for opportunities to work with the association on how to make examples relevant for local schools, districts, and states on the importance of the inclusion of this information. The second thing that we do on a regular basis is try to have peer-to-peer interactions and conversations, and so providing opportunities for states to talk with state departments of education, to talk with other state departments of education, providing opportunities for districts to talk with districts, and really bring in some subject matter experts to help to address real problems of practice. And so that's part of the technical assistance that we do. The other thing that we do on a regular basis is really try to listen to the field. And so actually next week, August 8th, we are bringing in some military families to have some conversations about the Every Student Succeeds Act and to hear what concerns are for students, how we can be focused on supporting improvement, where resources can be leveraged. And so we take the time to listen to the field to really figure out how we can support what's going on at the local level. So those are a couple of things that we're doing through non-regulatory guidance, through technical assistance, and also through really listening to what the problems and concerns are so that we can prioritize our actions also. The one thing that I do want to say is that the identifier that's used is separate from the impact aid program. So the Title I requirement for the military identifier is separate from the impact aid program that has a different definition. And so I just want to make sure there's no concerns about the impact to impact aid funds. But that's something that we are also helping to make plain and clear for the field as they embark on the implementation.
All right, thanks. So Mr. Cohen, you alluded to this in your opening remarks, but going with the theme again of policy to practice, talk a little bit more about the data piece of this. So, there's a requirement to collect data, then what? Now what happens, and how does that change things, or, should it change things?
Good. It should. It won't happen automatically, though, but just a couple of steps to keep in mind. The first thing, consistent with the idea that the federal government has a policy, but it gets executed and implemented at the local level, right? I'd encourage everyone here to be comfortable going to your local school district and making sure, right, that they are actually collecting the data that they need, number one, and number two, that you and other military families are actually providing, right, the information that's needed, right? You've got to make sure that you or your student on an enrollment form checks the right box. And by the way, if you don't see a box for National Guard and Reserve, you should at least ask about it, right? That would be, should create some interest and some pressure at the local level to make sure they're doing what they need to do. Second thing is you ought to be aware that in schools or districts where there may be a very small number of military-connected students, right, the report cards may not report anything, because if there aren't enough students of that type, right, particularly when you break down by race and gender and all that, right, it becomes there are privacy concerns. It becomes very easy to identify, or at least take a reasonably good guess at who individual kids are. And so some things are likely to get lost in here, and there's not a whole lot to be done about that. You've got competing goods and priorities to deal with.
Mike, can I interrupt just for a second?
Sure.
And ask Dr. Chisholm if you can talk about the N number?
Sure.
Because
so Mike is
that's a
referring
key
to
point.
Yes, to the N size. And so each state is required to identify for accountability purposes and for reporting purposes a student number that they will report against. And so it's called the N size. We've seen most states that have come in this first 17 states hover around 10 students, 10 to 15 students. I think the highest number that we have seen is 30 students so far, and so that's encouraging because under No Child Left Behind, we had some states that had an end size of 100. So states are really taking seriously the fact that they want to be accountable for all of their students and also very transparent in the reporting for all students. And so I'm really encouraged to see what we're seeing across states.
I guess just one other point I would make, which is as a parent or a network of parents, you don't actually need the data to have an idea of what the unique needs and challenges that your students face, right? And so the data is one thing, but getting together with other similarly situated parents and students, right, and begin to understand, identify for yourselves what are the needs that we see here for our kids, and make sure that those are issues that you bring to the attention of the teachers, the principal, the school board, et cetera, right? The data is important, but at some point, right, you've got pretty good data already, and you've got a basis for articulating needs and demands, and I would encourage you to be forceful about that.
Okay. General? So Dr. Biden mentioned this the other night when she was here. Roughly 500,000 children of the National Guard and Reserve. So the importance of making sure those children aren't left out of this view of things. But to Mike's point again, at the local level, just creating that visibility so that, as you said, how often does the general public, and especially at the school level, educators, teachers, et cetera, not even know they have Guard and Reserve children in their classrooms? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's common. I mean, it's very common. We talk about the Guard and Reserve being an operational force, and we are now. I mean, if you can listen or talk to General Milley like he was here yesterday, he will tell you that he cannot do his business. The Air Force cannot do what they have to do without the Air National Guard or without the Army National Guard or the Reserves. And so that's kind of, I don't want to say that's an anomaly, but that's only been happening in the last 12 to 15 years. And so to take that operational experience and put it to our families and stuff, it's new. It's new to the public. If you go question, John Q. Citizen out here, they'll ask you about the National Guard and say, well, yeah, they're in an armory down the street, and but if you're an employer that has that individual that has been gone for a year or 2 years or 3 years, they're aware that they understand, and getting that knowledge out to the public and to make them understand has not been an easy task. What we have done within the National Guard, we have, that the citizen soldier has a tremendous additional reach into their communities. And in this arena, to give you an example, one of my brigade commanders is a school superintendent in a county. So I guarantee you in his county that the kids are being identified. One of my former first sergeants was a school superintendent who is now a state representative. And he's doing, from his platform, is doing his best to network and advocate for the Guard and Reserve children across the country. We have a state senator in Tennessee who was very involved. He's a former 160th Special Operations Aviation guy at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He wrote a book, A Night with Saddam. He was the guy who gave Saddam his physical after they caught him. He has become a huge advocate for the Guard and Reserve because of his military experience, and he understands. He has children. So what we have to do is that we have to use all those people that we have that has another job and career to network and advocate for our military kids.
Okay. So Dr. Chisholm, to a point that both you and Mr. Cohen made earlier. So ESEA, 1965, and then 1994, and now 2015 for ESSA. These things don't happen overnight. It's very complicated. It takes a long time. You talked about 17 states.
17.
17 state plans. So can you help us with the timeline of sort of where we are today in implementation and when we get to sort of the next step?
Great. So when the law was passed, actually, in December 2015, there was a little error. It said that the implementation would begin in 2016. So we had to have that fixed very quickly through appropriations language. And so it delayed full implementation of the law until the 17-18 school year, the school year coming up. So this will be the first year that implementation happens. One of the things that is just natural in any transition is that it's going to take some time for state systems, local systems to change the direction that they're going. And recognizing that the Secretary used her transition authority to postpone for 1 year some of the provisions that are required by law. So there's some things that have already gone into effect, like as it relates to foster care students and transportation that went into effect last December. There are other things that will be phased in this school year. But the accountability systems, probably the biggest part of the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act, states are not required to move to those systems until next school year, the 18-19 school year. States can certainly, if they are ready to go, they can do that this year, but they are not required to do so until next year. So as part of the process that I mentioned through the state plan process, they are submitting what will be their indicators in the system, the metrics in the system, the supports, the interventions, how they will identify schools, and all of that is being reviewed and approved right now. The next set of states, the next 34 states, will submit their plans in September, and then we will work over the course of the next 4 months to approve that set of plans. And so hopefully by the first part of next year, all states will have an approved plan that then supports full implementation in the 18-19 school year. But it's not like a speeding train down a track. It is an evolution, not a revolution, in terms of how progress happens with the implementation. But one of the things that I think that is just exciting for me to see is that, and I've had the opportunity to work at the local level, the state level, now the federal level. And what I would say working from this level is that as long as you're doing things that are right for kids, you should never wait on the federal government. Right. As long as you're doing things that are right. There is a real
That's good advice on a number of fronts.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of hallmarks to pay attention to. Don't misuse funds, because there is like a real jail that you will go to if you misuse funds. But other than that, if you're not harming kids, go ahead and be empowered and take that action at the local level. It was, 15 years into the implementation of No Child Left Behind, and we were still writing guidance at the Department of Education to support implementation. So this is a long process, and the law is meant to be flexible, it's meant to be resilient, it's meant to be supportive of what states see as the best practices for their students.
All right, Mr. Cohen.
Couple of thoughts spurred by this conversation. One is, Monique is right, the federal government doesn't actually move quickly on these kinds of things. It's sort of a humbling experience to work there when you're trying to get something done. It is a slow-moving train. But secondly, keep in mind that the plans that states are submitting, first of all, we've been reading them, not nearly as carefully as you have, but we've been looking at a number of issues. From Achieve's point of view, we're all about college and career readiness. We're all about standards. And we've noticed a couple of things. One is, by and large, reading state Essa plans is a mind-numbing experience. It truly is. And that is partly because the law is mind-numbing to read. The structure that the plans have to take are based on the statute, it's not a quick, easy read. And you still don't necessarily know what's actually going on after you're done. Trust me. Secondly, states approach the plans in very different ways. So I've read the Tennessee plan, which is a really good one, and it continues the kind of leadership that Tennessee has been providing and the improvements that they've been making, right, compared to the rest of the country. And they really have used the plan as an opportunity to say, here's the direction that the state is taking to improve the education system, and here it is. Here's our approach, here's our vision, here's our strategy, et cetera. There are lots of other states that are viewing their plan, right, as a compliance exercise and basically asking themselves, what do we need to write down here? What information do we need to provide in order to get the funds that we want released, number one. Number two, how do we do this in a way that ties our hands as little as possible? And thirdly, in that guarantee, there are states where the leaders have said, you know, the more we put in the plan that's not required, the more we are going to put the federal government in a position of basically constantly monitoring what we're doing. Not exactly sure we want that. So let's just keep the plan narrow, focused, bureaucratic, right? It's not the big vision for the state. It's the document to release funds. So just understand that depending on your state, this could be very different visions, you know, for what this plan is all about and how to use it. Which just brings me back to a point I made early on. At the end of the day, the plan doesn't matter that much, except for whether it's in compliance or not, right? It is what's happening at the local school building in the local district, right? Is the school healthy? Right? Does it have a sound strategy for improving achievement on a continuous and regular basis? Are you getting the information you need about how well your child is doing and other children in the school are doing? Do you have access to the professionals, to the educators, to make sure you can have conversations with them? Those kinds of factors are ultimately going to matter no matter what's written in the state plan, no matter what the school or district sends to the state. It's still really what's happening in the school, and you've got lots of ways to influence and inform that don't require Monique to read something and decide whether it's okay or not.
Can I just add something to that? I fully agree. I think we're a little different in our opinions about this, though. So I do want to say that I think that...
That's because I'm a former federal...
That's because you're a former I do want to say that I do agree with you that at the classroom level, that the teacher in that classroom might not know what the state submitted in their state plan, and so that there might not be an awareness about that. But it does drive decision-making and resource allocation at the state. So I'll just take one example. For example, in the new law, there is a 7% set aside for Title I funds that goes towards school improvement. The state will make a decision about whether or not those funds go out to districts through a competition where districts compete for the money, or by formula. That has a very real impact on what happens in the day-to-day operations of the class. And so part of what I think is really important is to be empowered about what the law is so that you can use that in your conversations and advocacy at the local level. So I just differ slightly in saying that I think it's important to be informed so that you have the information to be an advocate for your local school districts. And so knowing that 7% is required allows for you to have a voice in the conversation about how those funds are distributed. And then even more importantly, when they get to the local level, making sure that they are being utilized in the right and effective ways.
So we used the train metaphor a couple of times, and one of my duties as a moderator is to keep the trains moving on time. And the doomsday clock says we're right on time. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. Thank you for your insights. Thank you all for your early morning attention. And with that, we're done.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage MCEC President and CEO, Dr. Mary Keller.
We're going to huddle for a picture. Can we gather up? Oh, I'm so sorry. All right, can y'all